Well, good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual book talk, The Story of Bob, The Life and Times of Reverend Robert W. Wood, with author Stephen Law. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. The Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, and our digital archive, which has more than 130,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. We're particularly excited about today's program with Stephen Law because it focuses on one of our major collection development areas, and that is on the LGBTQIA experience within Congregationalism. And as you're going to learn in today's talk, and when you go out and buy your copy of The Story of Bob, it's such an important story that we need to talk about more, maybe even more now here in 2026. I hope you will check out our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of other forthcoming events. So I'm going to ask our speaker to come up. Stephen C. Law is a writer whose work bridges faith and cultural engagement. His commitment to compassionate storytelling enriches the story of Bob with insight and empathy. Stephen Law holds degrees from Campbell University and Colgate-Rochester Crozer Divinity School, where his focus was Christian ethics and social policy. As an ordained pastor, he served rural and urban churches before studying creative writing with C. Michael Curtis. Chief among his accomplishments are 45 bliss-filled years with Dr. William Donald Stroud, with whom he created Decouvert Fine Art, an art gallery specializing in European master drawings, and you might see a few of those behind Stephen. He is the founder and president of the Law Stroud Foundation, and that's lawstroudfoundation.org. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for writing this book and for being with us today. I'll hand it over to you, and I'll come back for the Q&A.
Thank you, Kyle. Many thanks to you and your team, Kyle, and to all the folks at the United Church Pilgrim Press, and to all you taking the time to attend this book launch. I'm so grateful that you would take the time to experience this with me. In his poem, Two Voices, Tennyson wrote, "Moreover, something is or seems that touches me with mystic gleams, like glimpses of forgotten dreams, of something felt, like something here, of something done, I know not where, such as no language may declare." William James used this quote in his Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902. In this series of lectures at Harvard, James explored the psychological landscapes resulting from moral yeses and nos, or the push and pull of shifting excitements. Doesn't that sound like our culture these days? Moral yeses and nos, shifting excitements, resulting in claimed experiences with the divine and its impact on personal happiness and the evolution of what he called saintly dispositions, evidenced by empathy, kindness, loving regard, compassion, sacrifice for the greater good, and the like. For me, his observations offer a lens through which the story of Bob can be understood. Carl Jung's concept of individuation, developing a distinct, whole, and unique sense of self and personality, also comes to mind. Bob's earliest experience of the divine happened at home, where his family provided a sense of safety and belonging. Rhythms of family life were predictable. Rules instructed expected behavior. At Sunday school, Bob learned that Jesus loved children and that God's love could be experienced through home and church and school and parents and teachers and brothers and nature and all that was good in the world. God would take care of him if he was a good boy, stayed clean, acted nice, ate right, and obeyed adults. He won praise for church attendance and memorized Bible verses. On his 12th birthday, his brother Harold left home for the New York Military Academy, altering the family constellation. From the story of Bob, quote, later that day, at dusk, having opened presents and eaten cake and ice cream with my parents, I was drawn to my brother's old bedroom, where a shaft of light from an unseen source illuminated his bed. I fell to my knees beside my brother's bed and closed my eyes to pray. Thank you, God, for my 12 years, I said. They have passed so quickly. I still have so much to do. Could you let me live 90 more years? A warm feeling of two-way communication came over me. God had answered my prayers. I believe God had granted my desire to live another 90 years. And when I opened my eyes, the shaft of light had gone. End of quote. Now, you might think of that as being the imagination of a 12-year-old, but hang on with me. It's just one of many amazing evidences of the divine in his life. So life continued for Bob within a new family configuration. His experiences of home and school and church and scouts produced all sorts of wins and losses, successes and disappointments. Influenced by cultural norms and expectations, he tried his best to fit in as expected, as we all do. Religious ideas and experiences seem to be running in the background all the time, like the programs that run on our computers to maintain system functionality. Being right and good and proper with good manners was the default reset. One might wonder, with Carl Jung, when and how does individual personality break free from all the guidance and influence? Well, for Bob, and maybe for all of us, sexual fantasy and desire differentiated him for sure. Such thoughts had not been discussed or taught, and in every case, he was alone to figure out what they meant. Alone with a loincloth as an object of fantasy in the Boy Scouts, attraction to classmates in high schools and strangers while attending college, or on leave from the military training at Camp Shanks, New York, with his Army buddies, who found their way to a dance hall. Bob left the dance hall, walked around Times Square alone, bought some postcards, went to a movie, then ran back to catch the last bus back to the base. Quote, some of the men bragged about sexual conquest in a vulgar way. Like me, most of the men rode back to the base in silence. A necessary silence in Bob's case, as the letter Q, written in his war diary, reminded him about men he saw held in stockades with Qs on their backs, awaiting a dishonorable discharge. So fitting in and faith and perseverance brought him with so many others to Casablanca, where he saw Moorish domed buildings scattered across the landscape and veiled women walking among donkeys and charred military vehicles abandoned and bandaged soldiers, some on crutches, walking through rubbles. James would be all over a prayer Bob received from his mother during these apprehensive days. Quote, God, Father of freedom, look after that boy of mine, wherever he may be. Walk in upon him. Talk with him during the silent watches of the night and spur him to bravery when he faces the cruel foe. Transfer my prayer to his heart. I don't think that there's a mother listening to this pod or this webinar who doesn't understand that. Bob interpreted it this way. Her prayer felt like a blanket of protection, and I kept it close to me. Or entries from his war diary 12:8:43. Saw wild holly growing and dandelions still in bloom. Hope division gets relieved soon. 43. Morale down. Learn we're going forward instead of being relieved. Goodness knows what will happen tonight. God be with me. Quote, I caught a glimpse of the Creator God in the wild holly and blooming dandelions, and in the full moon that cast a glow over the battlefield. Once or twice, I wondered if God approved of all the destruction and suffering, and in those moments, I doubted God's providence. But such doubts only intensified a sense of doom. End of quote. Soon after, Bob was wounded and spent 22 months recovering in military hospitals. Only combat veterans and those that help them recover know the true impact on their psychology. Glad to be alive, crushed in spirit, haunted by destruction and killing, and then asked to return to a normal life. Bob coped by reading and rereading Psalm 91, like when someone devastated listens to a song over and over and over and over. Quote, you who live in the shelter of the Most High, my refuge and fortress. Under God's wings you will find refuge. You will not fear the terror of the night or the destruction that wastes at noonday. You who live in the shelter of the Most High, my refuge and fortress. Under God's wings you will find refuge. You will not fear the terror of the night or the destruction that wastes at noonday. You who live in the shelter of the Most High, my refuge and fortress. Under God's wings, you will find refuge. You will not fear the terror of the night or the destruction that wastes at noonday. Amid a search for meaning came a calling to serve God and a return to the University of Pennsylvania, where he encountered a different form of faith, a moralistic Puritan form with salvation at its core. Converts claiming a literal understanding of the scriptures, turning it into a weapon of judgment against homosexuals. Bob doubled down on his study of the Bible, as J. Bennett Gass thoughtfully describes in the foreword of our book. Quote, almost instinctively at a young age, he rejected faith that instilled fear in place of a more sorely needed love, compassion, and justice. His moral clarity was nearly pitch perfect. End of quote. I agree. Bob also learned how trusting one person, just one, with the truth of his sexual orientation could end his aspiration to serve God before he'd even started. As illustrated in this conversation with Dr. Fred Eigler, the Baptist chaplain of the Christian Association, who had invited Bob to conduct deputations, sermon-like speeches in local churches around Philadelphia about faith and war, who offered no guidance in the debate on scriptures, but whom Bob had somehow come to admire and trust, especially since Eigler had written a letter to recommend him for admittance to Oberlin Seminary. Why didn't you tell me that you were a queer? I would have never written a letter of recommendation for you if I had known. You write Dean Graham at Oberlin. You tell him of your dishonesty. And if he still wants to accept you, that's his decision. I felt like a cornered rabbit or a scolded child. Dry-mouthed, pathetic, caught like an animal in a trap, pulling, increasing my pain, dead and alive at the same time. There were no bombs going off now, just power exercised to diminish and exclude and humiliate. Such describes how deeply impactful a violation of trust can feel. Again, alone, Bob had some sorting out to do. He learned not to be persuaded by opinions about his experience generated by those outside his experience. to understand that those outside his experience could act in ways contrary to expectations, then justify their behavior from the point of view of the prevailing norm. He learned to expect humiliating, soul-crushing rejection out of the blue from such people with no apology. He learned to live through such humiliations as best he could. But careful readers will see that the humiliations became projections of sort, a stain that could be telepathically perceived by loved ones, like when his father underwent an emotional breakdown and was admitted to an insane asylum. Bob wondered if the Igler affair was the cause. Can you imagine? Today, we might ask ourselves, is it fair for people outside our experiences to make unchallenged moral judgments about us? Judgments about our sexual orientations or gender identities or banning books or erasing stories from culture and the like? Such judges do well to focus on their own sexuality and capacities or lack thereof for intimacy with others. So by the time Bob entered seminary, academic rigor was just not an exercise in creating a foundation professional ministry. It was a necessity for preparing to live outside the norms. Each course, taught by heterosexual men, I might add, offered up new understandings in church history, practical theology, hermeneutics, biblical studies, and theology. Homosexuals as such were hardly, if ever, mentioned. Attempts to include homosexuality in class writing or class dialogue led to rebuffs. Quote, I felt myself flirting with disaster. If I didn't push the subject couldn't harm me. Bob was on his own to formulate responses to the committee that would decide his fitness for ordination. To a question concerning the teachings of Jesus, Bob answered, listen to this. The kingdom of God exists beyond human thought or control or manipulation and is realized by God's incomprehensible love. And since God loves me, then God loves me as I am. Sin is the failure to engage this love. Unbelievable. When asked if he believed in prayer, Bob answered, I pray because I cannot live unaided, because my prayers are heard by some force more powerful than any in the world. I truly believe that I'm alive today because of prayer. To the question of morals as relative or absolute, he responded, morals are relative. Absolute standards exclude. When morals are perceived as absolute, we become judgmental. And he quoted Matthew 7:1, judge not, lest ye be judged. The story of Bob affords such a fuller exploration of this academic rigor and evolution of ideas, but time doesn't permit me to stay focused on this subject. So a committee's vote and an ordination service initiated Bob into Christian ministry, and he headed to Manhattan to begin a pastoral career that spanned 35 consecutive years in Spring Valley, New York, Newark, New Jersey, and Maynard, Massachusetts. He preached 1,610 sermons, never missed a Sunday due to illness. He had no data for the number of funerals or weddings or baptisms or counseling sessions or administrative meetings or denominational conference or ecumenical meetings and emergencies. Staggering. On his own time, he discovered in Manhattan a support group of sorts, the Mattachine Society, where he met gay professionals, including a sociologist, Ed Sagrin, who under a pseudonym, Donald Webster Corey, had written the book, The Homosexual in America. When Bob asked Ed why there was no mention of religion in his book, Ed said that he wasn't interested in the subject. And he said to Bob, if you're interested in it, why don't you write about it? So Bob wrote a book to settle once and for all the questions its education and church failed to ask, much less answer. 9 years before Stonewall, using a vanity press, he published Christ and a Homosexual, in which he described everything he had observed about gay culture. Quote, when a church member or religious leader claims that homosexuality is a sin, they attack the sacredness of human personality, he wrote. He asserted that believing homosexuals were Christians and encouraged biblical scholars to rethink the scriptures interpreted as condemning homosexuality, called for a lifting of the ban against gays in the military, and expressed his willingness to officiate same-sex marriages. Remember, 9 years before Stonewall. Also on his own time, without a how-to manual, just instincts, signals, impulses, and risk. He pursued sexual desire in pursuit of finding a mate. It didn't sink into Bob that sexual encounters did not mean relationships. For him, each one held promise. Readers might conclude that faith had taken leave. Careful readers might be convinced that faith helped him cope in the aftermath of failed relationships and kept hope alive that he would meet the man who would complete his life, Hugh Coulter, a rodeo cowboy artist, best summed up by a trip they made from New York to an agricultural fair in Vermont. Here I'm reading again from the story of Bob. Quote, "We wore boots, belts tooled by Hugh, and cowboy hats. On the ride up, we talked nonstop. The conversation between us were easy. After the fair, heading home in Hugh's station wagon, we pulled into a rest area. We were alone despite heavy fair traffic. Facing each other, we sat at a picnic table with our shirts off, our legs entwined. We held hands across the table and talked. Dusk was followed by darkness. Let's stretch out, Hugh said. On our backs, we watched the moon and stars. Soon, we were on our sides, kissing. You know, I don't have the slightest desire to go to the movie houses anymore, I said. And I have no desire to cruise Third Avenue. You are just what I always wanted in a lover, I whispered. This is my dream come true. I hope this never ends, Hugh said. The two would conduct a private marriage ceremony in the parsonage and form a loving and supportive relationship that spanned 26 years, during which Bob's experience of the divine called forth more saintly dispositions, inspired by the teachings of Jesus and the prophets, risking his career in the public square, joining pickets protesting the federal government's anti-gay employment practices, challenging denominational leaders to create ministries for gays and lesbians. Some leaders attacked his book, others laughed at him. Several counseled that he needed to accept people where they were and understand that the church had many priorities, including urban issues and women and African Americans and peace and the like. One might say that Bob successfully cracked open a door for the leaders who would later form the UCC Open and Affirming Coalition and out GLBTQ leadership within National Instrumentalities. In retirement, Bob took care of his aging mother and assisted Hugh, whose health was in decline. He was enjoying a long weekend at Hugh's house to welcome in the new year of 1989. He stayed up late to make a painting. The next day, Bob was out of bed first, so he made breakfast and called up. No answer. When he went to check, he discovered Hugh's lifeless bodies. Soon, EMTs and the police had arrived, and the police had questions. Anyone else in the house? When did you discover the body? What's his name? What's the address? What's his age? What's the nature of your relationship? Quote, I wanted to tell him that Hugh was my spouse, the love of my life, my mate, my partner, my lover, the one that had given so much romance and meaning to my life, but I uttered simply, I'm Mr. Coulter's pastor. Here, James and Young combine. In preparing for the funeral and the devastation of grief, a parishioner said to Bob, I'm sorry for the loss of your friend. And before he knew it, Bob said, he wasn't just my friend, he was my lover. And a threshold was crossed, and Bob became consumed with regrets about their choice to live apart. Few people, including his family, knew of his love for Hugh. He began to second-guess their decision to live apart, recalling moments when they'd stopped an impulse to hold hands or kiss so as not to offend. He prayed for forgiveness and meditated on 1 John 4:18. There is no fear in love, but perfect or mature love casts out all fear. And his path toward individuation began to open up. He shared his personal truth with his local church, then his brother. He allowed Out magazine to publish his photo and a photo essay on pioneers of the gay rights movement. He agreed to be interviewed for a documentary on the same subject. Articles about him appeared in the Advocate and the Gay Community News in Boston and the Concord Monitor, to name a few. He helped facilitate inclusive policies at his retirement community where he was living. He spoke to church groups, including an annual faith Holocaust service in which he led a remembrance of 500,000 pink triangle men killed with the Jews in Nazi concentration camps. Most importantly for Bob, he found ways to publicly acknowledge his relationship with Hugh, including much time spent in service to this book. During this process, Bob experienced some rejection and some affirmation. He was known. He also learned that times had changed and that he had something to do with that change. And he was known to everyone he knew as he was. And if this book does nothing else, the love between these two men has been made as clear as I can make it. I think the story of Bob creates a convincing case that Bob's experiences with the divine helped him to work out his own salvation, discover personal happiness, and saintly dispositions that led to a path home, a state of safety where he felt validated, celebrated, not tolerated, free of fear, and freely loving. And I hope with all my heart that it prepared him for his own peaceful transition away from this earth. You know, we inhabit this world for such a short time. Any idea that improves our character, helps us to live in love fully, is a good thing. Maybe reading the story of Bob will help us all discover ways to love better and discover home. Thanks. Thanks, Kyle.
You didn't warn me, Stephen, that I needed to have the box of tissues next to me for your presentation today. Thank you.
I didn't know it either. Thank you. Obviously, it's touching something inside of me that I didn't anticipate either.
Well, you know, and I think it speaks to the need that we have for Bob's story, right? Even now, even in 2026, maybe even more than ever. And you kind of alluded to that in your opening comments, but it also speaks to the choices that you've made in how to write this book, right? There are many different ways to write a biography. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the way you did your research and the way you felt like you wanted to bring Bob's voice to us.
Yeah, it's a very complicated business. I was studying short fiction with Mike Curtis at the time, and I went to visit Bob because he had, I read a newspaper, an article about the fact that he had lost Hugh, and I just thought that he could use a pastoral visit. I had no intention to write a book. I was simply making a pastoral visit. So when I went to visit him, the whole time that he was speaking with me, he was mourning this loss. So this whole business of Hugh and the regrets, that was very present in the room. And he inquired of me a few things about my life. And I said, well, I'm studying writing. And I have this wonderful relationship of 45 years. Well, it wasn't 45 years then with Donald. And he seemed intrigued by that. And he asked me if I'd be interested in pursuing a book. He introduced that idea, not me. And I said, well, I'll speak to Mike about it. And so I came and I asked Mike to meet me in Boston for lunch. Mike's comment was, well, you have the capacity, but don't make any promises you can't keep, because the publishing world is really quite it's a complicated world. But, please don't sell yourself short in terms of being able to handle the narrative. And just ask Bob for a period of time to see if a story exists. So I did. I asked Bob to give me 6 months. And if readers are curious about what those 6 months were about, it was about, this will be sounding Mike Curtis. I'm channeling him now in these comments. Stories, all stories for him were causally linked events that led to transforming moments. That they were really logical for him. They were very predictable. And the art of the story writer was to organize those events so that they were convincing and that people would be willing to go along for the ride. And so when that happened, then you realize that you're in the zone of creating art of some sort. So the thing was to ask Bob, what holds emotional weight for you? That was the initial question. What moments in your life hold emotional weight? And I started gaining a sense of what that landscape would be. And then I began to say, look at the people that populated that landscape, and got a list and went and to interview them all over the Northeast. Thank God they all lived in the Northeast, as far away as New York, and a lot of them, in Newark. And so I could take a ride, basically a day trip, and get to these people and interview them. By the way, a lot of those interviews are with you now at the Congregational Library, because you didn't say it at the offset, but Reverend Wood's entire collection of archives are part of the library's holdings.
Yep, and I've just put a link to the finding aid into the chat. It's a very important collection that's here. And I see that Rick Taylor is on the call, who was also instrumental in working with Reverend Wood to make sure that those papers got here. And I think it raises important questions about whose voice needs to be preserved. And often, what we find, and this is for anyone who is watching this in our audience, many people feel their voices, for Bob to approach you about doing a book, right, is actually kind of uncommon, right? More often,
Very.
Well, not me, I'm not an important part of this story, but these voices are. I mean, these are crucially important.
Yeah. And, your whole idea about voice in itself, in the first few years when I was organizing it in third person, there were competing voices. And my writing group and Mike challenged me to deal with that problem. The other problem that was very present on the page was the lack of feeling, internal life, because Bob was from the generation of the greatest generation. Many war veterans came back and their psychology shut them down in terms of feeling or access to the internal life. And so that was the other major challenge. And I was sitting in my office one day saying, well, how am I going to meet that challenge? And I began to experiment by turning what was in third person into a first person narrative, just as an experience to solve those problems. Because if you're writing in the first person, internal narrative is demanded. It truly, feelings are demanded. It makes it more immediate. So by solving those three problems just in the writing of it, I came up with this form, and it seemed to work. At least my writing group suggests you're on to something here. Keep it going.
Well, thank you. I think it's fantastic that you did take that approach, and I think it gives it an immediacy. And the questions have been coming in while I've been just wanting to pepper you with questions, Stephen. So let's go to one from Wayne Marabella, who writes, Mr. Law, clearly you are moved by Bob's story and empathetic to his experiences and struggles. Is this indicative of your own experiences and, sadly, the struggles so many in society today endure?
Well, that's fair, Wayne, Mr. Mirabella. That's a fair. Obviously, in my reactions to the narrative I created today, I was hooked at places. And certainly at the point of grief, I'm still tender around the loss of my own spouse of 45 years. Remembering the seminary experience, and I don't know how many people in the audience may have experienced seminary, but I never even thought about the fact that all of those courses I was taking were being taught by heterosexual men. It didn't even occur to me until just now. And this is all sort of awakening within me what my life experience has been in the formation of my own pastoral life. And I'm not saying that heterosexual men can't handle vast array of academic rigor that's involved in theological pursuits. Just the opposite. I have utmost respect for every one of my professors in seminary, many of whom had huge impact on my life. But I did have to reflect about the fact that in my day, even a generation later, I didn't have the opportunity to raise the subject. And I'm sure that many women were in situations where they were in rooms with people studying these ideas, and their stories were not a part of that conversation. And, they might have felt that way even in the book about Bob, which did not, and, didn't lift up the stories of women. But I was always saying, because I've been asked this too, was that a shortcoming? And I said, no, I have to stay truth to the facts in front of me. I can't make up things. But I think most any woman could feel what Bob felt in a circumstance where his own life story was not appreciated and fully understood, and what his potential as a human being wasn't being recognized in its full form. And I'm sure I don't have to I don't think I'm gonna have to second guess that any woman in this audience, and probably neurodivergent people now, and certainly transgender people now, probably are still experiencing it. Still, they can come to a party or they can come to an event, but would their story be fully understood if people don't take the time to listen to what their story is and take in the details of those lives so that they can gain a pathway into understanding that life? So what you do by providing the resources for people to explore that is, an amazing, it creates a palette for anyone interested in history to be able to come in and to say, well, here's a story, here's a circumstance, here's a context. Let me explore this for a while and see where it leads.
Wonderfully put. A comment here from Jennifer Tanner, who writes, I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that this was a beautiful webinar. We love you, Stephen. We are so grateful for you. And the Congregational Library feels the same. I think we speak for many in the audience, so thank you. Eric Page, one of our great board members here, writes, I was struck by the similarities between Bob Wood's life and Reverend Troy Perry, the founder of the Metropolitan Community Church. Did they know each other?
I think Bob was probably challenged at times by Troy to move outside his own vocational choices. He was locked into a vocation. As I said, if you remember that one paragraph, 36 uninterrupted years in pastoral ministry, not a single Sunday missed. That's pretty much a dedication to a vocation. And I think that perhaps Troy was at a point of giving up on the institutions that were not serving and finding ways to keep people involved in faith conversations. And I don't think they knew each other personally, but I think that they maybe challenged one another, maybe. Thank you for the question. But to Jennifer's question, I do want to speak about that, if you don't mind, or that comment. I would say that of all the reasons I took so much time in this and in coming to the idea of servicing this book over the last year, I really think that Jennifer and her wife, Stacy, and their son, Abe, who's 9 years old, they're part of my chosen family. And I met them after Donald died, and they've been present for me in ways that I can't even put into words. So here, William James would have to come in and interpret this. But it really grieves me, Kyle, grieves my soul that generation, she's got to explain hate to a 9-year-old son. Now, I've had enough. Really. Our culture has to be more civil, has to be more loving, and we have to get there because we can't leave people like Jennifer and Stacy raising their children with any kind of doubts about who they are as people, as precious people, especially not being tolerated, but being celebrated. And I love them just like I would my own daughter or my own children. I feel such a connection to them. And young Abe feels just like a little grandson to me. And already he's teaching me amazing things. But, if we have no other reason for caring about history, Kyle, it's about bringing people who may not be at this webinar, younger people, for whom I probably seem like an old cast off, but still, I want to encourage them in their life and be present for them in any way that I can, because I don't know how they're finding their way and how they find their own moral centers. But I know in this case, there's plenty of love to go around.
Love and wisdom are absolutely needed, and sadly, sometimes in too short supply when you look on the various media that we consume, for example.
Yeah.
It's great to have this webinar, and we will, so everybody in the audience knows, we are recording this. We'll release it in a couple weeks, so you can share it with all your friends who should be watching right now, but who aren't. So maybe this dovetails to a question from Amy Allen, and she writes, what would Bob think about the book being published now in these times? And she also asked a practical question. Over what time frame did you do the interviews with Bob?
6 years.
Okay.
So that's went on for 6 years. I can answer that one very quickly. And, it was like a quilt. I would say it resembled a quilt at the end of 6 years that we began to piece together a narrative around. How would Bob respond to it? I think he would zone in on this whole point. I don't even think he recognized it when he was speaking to me. What he had to learn in being alone and navigating alone, I think he had to learn some things. And I think that we can't really find our path always through institutions. Sometimes we are left alone to figure things out. So I think he would invite people to think about who that you can trust with your story. I think he would be really zoned in on that. And I think he would be very zoned in on who it is that you allow to dictate the terms of comment on your experience. He would know for sure that if you're living outside my experience and you don't have empathy and you're sort of, wanting to comment on that from a moral point of view, you watch out because I'm coming after you. And I'm feeling that myself right now. To anyone that has any sense that I'm not going to take on any kind of voice in our culture right now that I find myself in opposition to or in conversation with, maybe not in opposition to, but in conversation with, I will say we all have an obligation to find out what our moral centers are so that we can speak to those conversations. So if someone claims to be leading our country because they have a moral of some sorts guiding them, I will say I will rest until I find out what that moral is. Where does that morality come from? And what is the authority that produces it? Was there any kind of effort made, any kind of rigorous academic training around it, any kind of pursuit of ideas that merits anybody's attention? There's enough of all this moral positioning in our world, and people have to be held account for their moral reasoning.
Well said. Craig Hoffman writes, thank you for your vulnerability in your presentation. I too was moved to tears remembering the rejection I experienced in my own as a gay man seeking ordination.
Well, so there you go. And that for all of us was at risk. And I remember when I sought my own ordination, it was an irony. If you have a minute for an anecdote, it was really an irony. When Donald and I were together, it was at a point where I had divorced my wife. And so I had brought a lie into my relationship with my wife that I married when I was 18 years old, and we had 8 years together. Very loving rapport, and went through a lot together. But as seminary taught me, we had Jungian psychotherapy, we had all sorts of clinical classes as well as theological classes, and I was turned inside out, and I was forced to see that I wasn't particularly honest, fully honest with my wife, and I needed to come to terms with that. So I did that, and then after that, I had the luck of all luck. I met Donald, and after a period of time, I didn't know what it meant to say yes to that. I just didn't. I mean, it took years for me to warm up to the idea that he might be the one. But thank God I had enough instinct to say, okay, let's stay open-minded. But by the time I got to the point of ordination, I had already lost a wife and gained a husband of sorts. We weren't officially married. But I was not going to be anything but honest and forthcoming in my interviews. So they could take me or leave me. I could have cared less. I could have cared less. I promise you I could have cared less. But I spoke my truth about the scriptures, and I had an ecclesiological statement and a Christological statement all worked out the same way Bob did. I had to just work it out on my own and utilizing the theology that informed me. That was Rauschenbusch, Niebuhr, the whole social gospel movement, the liberation theology. I mean, my God, what a time to be alive in theology. And by the way, there wouldn't have been a civil rights movement in this country without liberation theology. So Martin Luther King was also at Crozier, taught by the same people I was. So anyway, sitting around the same kind of room being asked questions, and for 3 days, asking me about church administration, what I thought about the Bible as literal, all sorts of questions. You know how it is. No one's asking about the elephant in the room because it's expressly stated on my profile. No one. At the end of the third day, a laywoman looks up and she says to me this question: "What do you do?" And I said, "What do you mean, what do I do?" She says, "Who cooks?" I said to her, "Well, you know, what an amazing question. We both cook. We don't have a prescribed domestic agenda. He's a physician. I hope to be a congregational minister. We have to manage our days the best way we can, and there's not a gender associated with them." But I said this to her. I said, "You know what, I can tell you for sure. There's not a meal that's ever put on our table that both of us don't understand that someone had to think up what to cook. Someone had to go to the grocery store and lovingly shop for food. And then someone came home and prepared that food, filling our home with this amazing smell. And in our case, because we are who we are, aesthetically presented it in a way that was pleasing." So I said to her, there was never a meal that was ever put in front of either one of us that both of us did not feel deeply moved by the experience of eating together. She began to weep like a baby at this meeting. And I took the Kleenex over to her and I asked her, I told her I was so sorry that anything that I said would be so upsetting. And she said to me, she said, "I've been living in a home with a husband and a son." I don't know how many years she had been living that. I had been doing all the cooking, and not once had anyone ever expressed appreciation for it. That still breaks my heart.
Thank you. That's oh man, I'm gonna get the Kleenex out again. So let's go to Marnie Warner will save us with a wonderful question. Marnie, great friend of the library, and I think who you know, Stephen. Is anyone working on a book discussion tool with questions for discernment and sharing around the book?
Arnie, good for you to come up with that great idea. I think that, as Kyle pointed out earlier, some of on the story of Bob, this is not self-serving, it's just true. At that website, there are already thematic ideas that can guide people into conversations. Hopefully this recording will help. But of course, I'm always available within reason to be helpful to people to explore it if you find my points of view interesting.
Wonderful comment here from Chris Burke, who writes, "What a beautiful story, Stephen. We need this!" Exclamation point. I agree. "I'm proud to be your friend and colleague at the Lost Stroud Foundation. I'm thrilled about this book and its potential impact."
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
No, she's like so many people that show up in life. One of the things I had to get used to after Donald died was what form love would take, or if it even existed. So I think, Kyle, when I first met you, and this whole project was sort of unfolding the way it did, and I owe you everything related to this. You should tell that story, or I am willing to. But Kyle, without Kyle, this book never would have made it to print. That's for sure. I'm sure. And because I was in this state of devastation and numbness and really deep grief. But I had to wake up to the idea that things could happen in grief that are pretty remarkable. And the beginning of the foundation, the starting of it, happened the day after Donald died in a dream. So the people that don't believe about ideas, divine ideas, or paying attention to ideas that seem irrational, I would advise them to stay open-minded, at least. Because if I hadn't paid attention to that dream, we wouldn't have a foundation now that is now in its fourth year with the likes of Chris Burke on our board and many other board members that are encouraging compassionate care in medicine in a big way. And we've transformed the medical school already. And also helping people living longer stay at home as long as they can. And that's our mission. And, you know, we're about it on a daily basis. So I think about now, that's my event that I'm bringing into the world in the devastation of grief. Bob brought this book into the world in his point of devastation of grief. It's amazing. And then the other thing that I just add to it, one stops wondering when you're in that state of grief, will love ever be present for me? Ever again? There's only one Donald. So in that form, that's definitely in the rearview mirror, except for the presence I feel with him every single day of my life. But the truth is, even around this book and around the foundation, I had to acknowledge that love just keeps showing up. It just keeps showing up. And I had to learn to recognize it and to be present in that. And I could sit here and bore you for hours on that subject. A lot of loving people in the world.
And there's a lot of love in our audience today. Maybe it's sort of just a final question. And this is, a part of the story that maybe some folks don't know. This is a book that's also kind of 20 years in the making. What does it mean for you to be publishing it with Pilgrim Press? The great kind of descendant of the Congregational Publishing House, with somebody who I think the world of, Rachel Hackenberg, wonderful publisher. You weren't able to 20 years ago maybe get it out there, and I don't know how much you want to talk about that, but what does it mean today for it to be coming out with Pilgrim Press?
Well, I have to say, quite honestly, I had lost a little confidence in the church. And so that would be my way of saying what I thought about the past, as much as needed to be said. And, in my own statement about ecclesiology, I've had to come to some shifts in my understanding of what I think the body of Christ is. I mean, this is a whole different subject. But in terms of working with Rachel and Adam and all the people that have been present over the last year, I couldn't ask for a better group of people. The editing has gone so very well. There's been great sensitivity to the text at all levels. There's been some appreciation even for what I understand their understanding is, some affirmation that this narrative means something to them as literature, not just as. I've gotten some feedback that makes me feel like maybe something about this, the way it was written, the way the words live on the page, mattered to them. And I think that they are working as hard as any small press can work. And I think that of them as a small press. I put them in that league. I may be misstating this because I don't know the publishing industry. So forgive me if I'm wrong about it. But I think all smaller presses have their own challenges right now, real economic challenges to stay alive, just like bookstores. So I give them credit for seeing the possibility in the story, and I owe them a huge debt of gratitude for. I mean, would it have happened if it happened 20 years ago? Well, maybe. I don't know. It happens now, and we'll see what's next. If I have other ideas that I might want to pursue as a writer, I think that there are a few.
Well, thank you so much for giving this to us. Thank you for, and I'm sure Bob thanks you, and I'm sure Donald is very happy to have this out in the world, and for you to have made this contribution. So thanks, everyone. We will see you at the next virtual program. Take care.
Bye.